Alright, this is John Cullo with OKRaw.com. Today we have another exciting episode for you. And this episode is actually spurred on by a raw vegan friend of mine who recently said that if you're eating cooked food, you are addicted, and that cooked food is addicting. I'm going to share my thoughts on addiction, but also more importantly, I'm sharing published studies on if cooked foods are actually addictive and actually what kind of foods actually are addictive if in fact they are addictive or have addictive properties, right? When I was earlier on in my raw foods career, I may have also agreed with them and said that cooked foods are addictive, going through my own personal journey, my own personal experiences way back in the day when I first got into a raw vegan diet. I would go back to eating some baked potatoes, and then I just want to eat baked potato every day and not want to eat as much raw foods. These days, things are a lot different for me. I've dealt with a lot of health issues and also probably emotional eating issues because I have been a raw vegan for over 25 years straight, 99.9 as I like to say, where I had no overtly cooked foods, although maybe my, dried nuts or seeds or fruits or spices may have been heated too hot that I didn't know of, or maybe something in a raw vegan restaurant wasn't really raw. But nonetheless, I didn't eat any heat processed foods, and after going on 25 years of not eating anything heat processed, and now that I'm heating foods, some people may claim that, oh, John has an addiction, he never lost his addiction to cooked foods, and now he's just eating it all back again. Well, here's the thing, I'll tell you guys straight up, I'm highly regimented in what I'm doing. I'm highly systematic in what I'm doing, and I don't have any addiction to cooked foods. And if we look at the science, they will not tell you that all cooked foods are addictive. So I just want to bust some raw vegan myths out there about cooked foods and being addictive. And also too, I want to bust the raw vegan myths. I have many videos on this discussion topic that not all cooked foods, or as I like to say, heat processed foods, because heating is just one type of process. You could put things in a blender, you run your Vitamix for 2 minutes, it heats it up. And actually, if you run your Vitamix too long, it could cook it and make it too hot. Is it cooked and now therefore is it just completely bad and wrong and gonna hurt your health? And so my personal opinion on this, and based on the science also, is that it depends, right? What the food is you're eating, how it is processed specifically, right? There are methods of processing your food and keeping it raw, such as dehydration, that I covered in my last episode. Link down below if you guys didn't see that, where I compare dehydration to steaming. And I make the point that, hey, in some cases, actually eating steamed food may be better than eating dehydrated food. That being said, I will also say in the same sentence that, hey, in most cases, eating raw foods is always the best, and we shouldn't necessarily use heat processing to eat our food if we don't need to or have a specific reason why you're doing it. And actually that comes to the reason why is John Kohler eating heat processed foods? Well, once again, link down below to my video where I go into, which is titled, Why a 26-Year Raw Vegan Started Eating Heat Processed Foods or Cooked Foods for Better Health, right? I'm eating the heat processed food specifically to better my health because I believe that enhancing and creating a greater diversity of foods in my diet, as well as the methods that they are processed, will benefit not just me, but more important than me, because, on the planet, unfortunately, we have a very human-centric culture. Like, we think we're the center of the freaking universe, and we are not. We share this earth with other earthlings. Earthlings is a movie I'd encourage you guys to watch because we're very human-centric. We need to think about other creatures, and hey, vegans do this because they don't want to hurt other creatures or other animals, and so that's great. But beyond just the animals on the planet, there's more of something inside of us that is actually not us. And so here's the thing. We have about 30 trillion human cells inside of us. And you're thinking, wow, 30 trillion. I mean, I can't even count that high. I don't even know how many zeros that is. I don't know. But here's the thing, guys and girls, right? There is 39 trillion microbial cells inside of us that are not us. So you're going to be human-centric and think, I'm just going to eat for me because I'm fed and nourished by only raw foods, which on some levels I could agree with that, hey, raw foods are probably the best for us in most cases, but then you're neglecting over 50% of you, which are over 50% of what's in your body, which is the microbes, right? That is not us. So let's not be entirely human-centric. That is a very important reason and why I started incorporating some heat processed foods, because I want to take the microbes, all their cells, and what they're going to do in my body, right, to give them food that they really love, because there is a relationship between them and us. They're not like parasites, right? We commingle, we live together. We need to help each other out. They give us our immune system. They're 70% of our immune system. They have so many things that they are helping us, making secondary metabolites such as butyrate, propionate, acetate, as well as other cofactors and things they're producing, regulating our internal gut microbiome, strengthening our gut mucosal lining, and so many other things. They can affect your glucose, your blood sugar spikes. I mean, it is completely endless. So just to think that, you know, hey, you're human-centric and you're only gonna eat for us, which, you know, I would agree with, you know, it's pretty much eating raw foods and frugivore for us, but let's nurture our microbiome. And I think that is really the conundrum, and maybe a little bit of the differences I may have with a lot of raw vegans out there, because I used to be in that as well before I started looking at science. You know, and that's why I'm experimenting with my diet. And I will say, my diet is an experiment. Whether you want to join me on this experiment and experiment yourself and see, because once again, if you eat something heat processed and then you don't feel as good, how do your microbes feel about what you've just eaten? So yeah, anyways, without further ado, let's just go ahead and get into the topic of this video at hand. Is all cooked food addictive, like some raw vegans would like you to believe? All right, so I found the perfect study to talk about this, and this is actually in the annual review of nutrition, and it says, is food addictive? A review of the science, where they're gonna tell us, is food addictive? Some people say food's not addictive, right? Drugs are addictive, but food not addictive. So let's see what a published study on food being addictive, and this is a review of scientific you know, knowledge being shared. So first we're going to go down to the abstract, and of course this is 24 pages. I'm not going to go over the entire thing, but what I will say is I will put a link down below to this full study if you are interested and curious in learning more about food addiction, addictive food-like substances, and everything in this published study. I'm only going to cover a fraction of it, some of the things that I believe to be the most important. All right, so going down the abstract, as ultra-processed foods, i.e. foods composed of mostly cheap industrial sources of dietary energy and nutrients plus additives, have become more abundant in our food supply, rates of obesity and diet-related disease have increased simultaneously. Food addiction has emerged as a phenotype of significant empirical interest within the past decade, conceptualized most commonly as substance-based addiction to ultra-processed food. Now let's go down a little bit further. They're basically talking about ultra-processed foods are what are potentially addictive, and that's what this published study goes into. Does it say cooked foods are addiction? No, it says ultra-processed foods, right? And here's the thing. Ultra-processed foods can be cooked, but maybe sometimes they could be in their raw state if they're processed not without heat. But they could still be processed foods. So not all cooked foods are ultra processed, and not all ultra processed are cooked, although probably most ultra processed foods are cooked, and actually highly cooked or processed in ways. And that's why I like to denote heat processing my food that is done in the Instant Pot is basically the only way I heat process my food, done at a lower temperature between 212 to 240 degrees, whereas, you know, I do not recommend heat processing your food above 248 degrees. That's when things change significantly. You can create significant amounts of toxins in the food. It makes the foods more hyper-palatable, in my opinion. And once again, I would say in general, but not always, the hotter the temperature you're using to cook your food, the more processing you're doing and the more damage you're doing to the actual food, and the less it will benefit you. So I don't want to lump all heat processed foods in one category. Let's go ahead and go down. This part is a very important part, and it's entitled A Dietary Evolutionary Mismatch. And so of course some of you guys believe in creationism, not evolution. I personally believe in evolution myself. Anyways, it says, for the vast majority of human existence, one of the biggest threats to survival was famine. Calorie-dense foods, like, you know, back in the millions of years ago, like fruits, nuts, and meats, were generally not abundantly available and were prone to conditions that would result in scarcity, i.e. weather changes, animal migration. So that means that, you know, before we had supermarkets on almost every corner, I know there are some food deserts out there, you know, we would have to hunt for our food like animals in nature. You know, the birds are out in the springtime. They're traveling, whatever, flying north for the summer and they go south for the winter time. But I mean, they live out in nature. I mean, thousands of years ago, we lived out in nature. We had to, like, basically harvest our food. And if we couldn't find food, we had to keep migrating or finding food. And when we found something, man, we would gorge ourselves and store the food. So it says, intake of calorie-dense ingredients, for example, sugar and fat, is effective in activating reward motivation systems, including the endogenous opioid and mesolimbic dopaminergic pathways. This enhances the subjective pleasure of consuming foods that are calorie dense and enhances motivation to seek them out. So this, once again, is in the context of millions of years ago when there was food scarcity. So then we basically just find food, we'd pig out, we like, oh, this tastes so great. And then, you know, and you could see the whole adaptive evolutionary response to food. And if we go down, it says, thus, reward, motivation, memory, and habit systems of the brain were selected by evolutionary pressures to support the receipt of sufficient calories as efficiently as possible through high-calorie foods. In contrast, excessive caloric intake was less of an evolutionary threat to survival, and systems designed to signal sufficient or excessive caloric intake were less essential. So what is that saying? That's saying we're designed to live in nature and forage our food where there would be scarcity. When we ate food, we'd get immense pleasure from it so that we could continue to live, right? And so we could go down further. Although human neural systems are primed to protect against caloric scarcity, the food environment has flipped these evolutionary advantages into risk factors and also, I will say, profit centers for companies that are basically taking advantage of your human neural system due to the evolution. The most prevalent calorie-dense food options have changed from those such as fruits, nuts, and meats, which I still believe you can overeat on, to ultra-processed foods that have high levels of industrial source calorie-dense ingredients. Example, high fructose corn syrup, trans fats. Interestingly, naturally occurring foods that are more calorically dense are typically either high in sugar, for example, fruit, high in fat, example, meat and nuts, but rarely are they high in both, unless you're making recipes, of course. In contrast, the ultra-processed foods in our modern environment are often composed of combinations of ingredients, white flour, sugar, and fat at levels typically not seen in nature. So, I mean, basically what they're describing here is what is called the pleasure trap. This is a very good book, linked in my Amazon shop by Dr. Alan Goldhammer and Doug Lyle. And I encourage you guys to read that book because it'll really shed a lot of light on this whole specific situation in greater detail than just a few short paragraphs that I've summarized, okay? And this is very important to understand, that we all live in this pleasure trap food, and that the processed foods of today are basically giving in to our pleasures, into our literally human programming is what I will say personally, you know, just to survive. All right, so let's go ahead and continue. And now this is where it gets interesting, because now it says parallels with addictive drugs. So now they're going to compare how foods have very similar qualities to addictive drugs. And we could go down and read it. It says humans create addictive substances by processing naturally occurring substances, for example, fermenting fruits into wine, drying tobacco and cannabis leaves for cigarettes into products with unnaturally high doses of reinforcing ingredients. For example, ethanol, nicotine, THC, that are effective at activating reward motion systems. These processed products are typically combined with other additives that further enhance their rewarding effects. Added sugars in alcoholic beverages, methanol in cigarettes, and addictive potential. Similarity, ultra-processed foods are created by combining processed ingredients, for example, high fructose corn syrup, white flour, and additives, flavor enhancers into novel products with unnaturally high levels of rewarding ingredients such as refined carbohydrates and fat, and I would say sugar, of course. One of the most important factors in determining addictive potential is the speed at which the substance is absorbed into the body. This is very important, guys, so listen up. Delivery mechanisms that lead to rapid absorption of the addictive ingredient, like smoking a cigarette, snorting cocaine, or quickly consuming a shot of liquor, or even like smoking cannabis, all increase addictive potential. In contrast, slowing the absorption rate of an addictive substance can transform an addictive drug into a therapeutic medication, as is the case for slow-release nicotine patches that aid attempts to quit smoking and slow-release stimulant medications used to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. In parallel, the creation of ultra-processed food often includes the removal of ingredients such as fiber, water, and protein that slow the rate of absorption of rewarding ingredients like sugar into the system, and addition of ingredients like texturizers that increase how quickly the food can be consumed. So, here's the thing. I'm an outright straight advocate for eating cannabis plants, right? When I eat a leaf of cannabis, it's not dehydrated. It has the natural amounts of water, fiber, phytochemicals, and phytonutrients, and smaller amounts of THC given the whole. And I don't get high from eating a few cannabis leaves in my salad, right? If you start dehydrating them and powdering them up and then eating them, yes, of course, you could have some, intoxicating effects if that's what you're looking for. That's not what I'm looking for. But here's the thing. Once we start processing food, right, the harder core we process food, the more we remove some of these different components of the food, then it can make it highly addictive, according to this published article, if you believe the science. So let's go ahead and continue down. All right, now we're gonna get to the answer to the question, which foods may be addictive? So this is where it's fun. Well, let's say all cooked foods are addictive, according to science. It's actually not, sorry. All right, so it says, ultra-processed foods, which are defined as foods with added amounts of fat and or refined carbohydrates, example, chocolate, chips, and pizza. I know some of those are your favorite things you love to eat, right? Also identified as group 4 in the NOVA classification system, and they basically classified foods as, minimally processed or ultra-processed, and group 4 is like the ultra-processed foods, were consistently more associated with YFAS indicators, and that's basically their system to determine if something is addictive or not, then were naturally occurring minimally processed foods, for example, fruit, vegetables, and lean protein. And then going down further, paralleling findings from Schultz and colleagues, ultra-processed foods have been identified as most implicated as YFAS indicators or perceived experience of addictive-like eating by a number of self-reported studies. Additionally, the consumption of ultra-processed foods has been associated with subjective experiences of reward that have predicted the abuse liability of addictive substances, such as elevated cravings, enjoyment, and satisfaction. Repeatedly, ultra-processed foods are more commonly linked to behavioral features of addiction, such as increased loss of control of eating and binge consumption. So yeah, blame that on the ultra-processed foods, such as chocolate, pizzas, chips, and that's when, people would say, oh, things in packages, bottles, and jars. I mean, in most cases, they're ultra-processed, although there are exceptions to that rule even. So let's go down a little bit further, down to refined carbohydrates. So it says refined carbohydrates, including sugar and white flour, are metabolized similarly in the body, and we're going to go down further. And it says that, thus, refined carbohydrates appear to alter reward-related physiological and metabolic responses in manner that may directly perpetuate problematic overconsumption. In preclinical studies, prolonged intermittent consumption of sugar, a refined carbohydrate, has been associated with behavioral features of addiction, such as binge eating, increased intake, over time suggesting of tolerance, and opiate-like withdrawal when removed from the diet. So, what I will say is this. I will say that there have been some raw vegans in the past who eat sugar and they just can't get enough sugar from the fruit. So then they start dumping sugar in their smoothies, claiming it's healthy because carb the F up, sugar's the healthiest thing. And, I definitely would not agree with that. And furthermore, I would say that, there's a thing is overeating fruit, right? If you're overeating fruit, and then you could be eating too much fruit because now you are getting too much sugar if you're overeating fruit, because in the definition of overeating, it means you're eating too much, an overconsumption. Also, too, when you're overeating fruit, that means you're going to be under-eating other foods, because other foods are going to displace the calories that could have been took up by the fruit, such as vegetables and other whole food plant foods, such as beans, legumes, and grains, and some of which can actually even be eaten raw. And then now we can go down to fat. So while refined carbohydrates appear to modulate responses in dopaminergic reward regions, e.g. striatum, based on fluctuations in glucose, dietary fat has been more associated with rewarding somosensory properties such as texture, flavor, and taste. Notably, the types of dietary fat most often found in ultra-processed foods, example, saturated and trans fat, yield elevated reward response compared with dietary fat most commonly present in naturally occurring foods, for example, unsaturated fat. So, you know, if you have to eat a lot of coconut butter or coconut oil, right, these have saturated fats even in more of a whole food style diet. You know, if you have dried coconut flakes a lot, right? All right, let's go ahead and continue on. So now they're going to talk about fats and carbohydrates, so a case for the combination. Well, there's some ultra-processed food that contain elevated amounts of only refined carbohydrates. For example, gummy candy, soda, white bread are only fat, cheeses, and bacon. That's why one of the reasons why cheese is so addictive is because it's fat. It also has got, in many cases, salt added, which we'll discuss in a minute. The majority of ultra-processed foods that have been most implicated in addictive like eating have the combination of being both high fat and refined carbohydrates, such as pastries, potato chips, pizza, cheeseburgers, french fries, and ice cream. I'd even say things like, you know, cookies, for example, right? And it says, interestingly, the combination of fat and refined carbohydrates does not exist naturally occurring in foods, and thus these foods may have the highest possible dose of rewarding ingredients because you're combining the best of both worlds, fat and the sugar. That being said, right, hardcore raw vegans would say that, hey, eating a raw food dessert where they basically take, you know, shredded coconut, grind that into, you know, the crust or with some nuts and dates. They're combining, once again, the sugar with the fat, right? And then, you know, gourmet chefs will even put salt in there. So now you got that's like the classic pleasure trap food, but it's raw and vegan, so it's healthy, right? I mean, definitely having a raw food dessert, not the worst thing in the world for you, but we should not still classify it as a health food. You know, fresh fruits, fresh vegetables, and I would, you know, I would even say steamed greens would be better than a, you know, raw food dessert bomb that's gonna, to a much lesser extent, set off those pleasure centers in your brain than, say, you know, some processed cookie. But nonetheless, we need to be aware about this and the potential downfall of eating, you know, processed raw foods. So for example, you know, I'm not a fan of extracted fats in general, you know, like coconut oil. I'm not a fan of dehydrated fruits, because here's the thing, guys, when they make ultra processed foods, they're removing certain components of the food. So they could be removing things like the fiber, they could be removing the water, right? They're maybe pulling out one specific quality of the food, right? And to a much lesser extent, that could also happen in a raw vegan diet. You could make fruit juice. You're removing the fiber. That's going to kick up the absorption of the sugar and make it go faster in your bloodstream, and then you're going to get more of a rush. It's going to feel better for you. And I believe, you know, too much of that is not a good thing, as does the science. I think the science would recommend less than 200, 300 milliliter of fruit juice a day if you choose to drink fruit juice. That being said, I see so many people on juice fast drinking copious amounts of fruit juice, and yes, while it is still healthier than drinking soda, I recommend drinking vegetable juices. Today, for example, I had 2 quarts of vegetable juices, all green juice, and then a root juice. Links down below in my videos if I remember, on my basic root juice and green juice recipe that contains, you know, my green juice has 0 fruits in it, and my root juice sometimes will have a little fruits. I think this time I use a little bit of apples in there. But I really recommend you guys drinking juices from vegetables that are going to be, you know, things that you normally wouldn't eat in as high quantities. We don't need to juice our fruits to eat more fruits, because hopefully they're ripe, delicious, as they are right out of nature. If you want to process your fruits, I do recommend vacuum blending them. Likewise, I do not advocate for dehydrating fruits and eating a lot of dehydrated fruits. Yes, this goes for dates. I mean, a date farmer could disagree with me. Dates are not dehydrated, they come off the tree that way. I mean, here's the thing. I'm looking at the water content of dates, which is a lot lower than most other fresh fruits. For example, I mean, bananas are lower on the level of water content as well, but dates even have less, so that when the water content is removed, and yes, there's good fiber and good minerals and good phytonutrients in dates, but there's an awful lot of sugar, and I see so many raw vegans just overeat on dates. I mean, I'm guilty. I did this when I was new into raw veganism, and you know, I would eat too many dates. So you guys should learn about these pleasure trap foods. That's why I'm making this video. So let's go ahead and go down, and I know some of you guys are getting bored by this, so I'll try to make it a little bit more interesting. All right, it says reward-related neural activation to the ultra-processed foods cue high in both fat and refined carbohydrates produce a supra-additive response that was greater than the sum of the activation for ultra-processed food cues high in only fat or only refined carbohydrates. So once again, the sugar and fat bomb. And then going down, it says, for instance, perhaps refined carbohydrates are the addictive agent in ultra-processed foods, given that they act on addictive-like dopaminergic systems, but fat enhances sensory rewards and blunts negative side effects of consuming large amounts of sugar, e.g., reducing glycemic index, blunting withdrawal responses to create an ideal combination of these rewarding ingredients. So really, they're just, I mean, the thing that's addictive about the foods, according to this article, and my opinions, are when you highly process foods, clearly ultra-processed foods with fat and carbohydrates, such as sugar, but even, in my opinion, to a much lesser extent, you know, foods that we find that are raw that also are high in fat and sugar, and then combining those like raw food desserts. And for those of you guys that want to treat, I found out that my local Sprouts Farmers Market recently just put on the Nats raw desserts that are in the freezer case, like half off. So they're like $5. They used to be 10. So I mean, I did buy a few, but I'm not eating them all at once, and it's like a nice special treat on rare instance. But yeah, they're amazing. But I guess they didn't sell well enough because nobody likes raw treats. All right, let's go down a little bit further. So this talks about other potential contributors, you know, to the ultra-processed foods and to this whole reward, you know, activation system. Salt. And it says Corsi's and Gold introduced the salted food addiction hypothesis. That's why it's like salt, sugar, and oil in SOS-free diet, which posits that salted foods act as a mild opiate antagonist in a manner that perpetuates overeating and obesity. And then it says at the bottom, there are no ultra-processed foods that are high only in salt, which may suggest that salt may contribute to more of a complementary manner to enhance the rewarding properties of ingredients such as fat or refined carbohydrates. So think, you know, cheese. Almost all cheeses have salt added. Now you're getting a big fat hit with the salt, and it lights up your brain, and that's why there's so many vegetarians that can't get out of the whole cheese addiction, and they don't become vegan. Actually, I met one the other day that I was talking to online. You know, it's probably because of the salt and the fat. So hey, could you substitute that for a nut-based cheese, which is a better source of fat in my opinion than a cheese, you know, fat from animals with some salt? Yes, that'd be definitely better. I mean, I'd say, you know, try and even move past that, and then making a nut cheese with no salt added could be better. And then it says, it is clear that all foods are not equally likely to be consumed addictive, particularly occurring naturally. Minimally processed foods, for example, fruits, vegetables, legumes. So they're saying that fruits, vegetables, and legumes are not addictive, right? You know, so if you steam vegetables, is that addictive? And according to this published study, no. I mean, if you steam your vegetables and then add, you know, olive oil or coconut oil to it, and then sugar and salt, then I would say yes, that could be more addictive than just plain vegetables. But what I'll tell you guys is that, like, here's the thing. I think some raw vegans, when they go and they start eating heat processed food, they have one little thing of cooked and they're like, I messed up. I'm just going to start eating the foods. You know, there's some extra food that my kid that didn't eat from the you know, the restaurant. I'm just going to eat it. That's where you run into problems, in my personal opinion, because now those are hyper palatable, ultra processed foods that have the added fat, added sugar, added oil, added salt. And this is not the way I'm eating my heat processed foods. I cook in the Instant Pot. Actually, we're steaming some potatoes right now that are going to be eaten plain, without the extra additives, right? And of course, then you could also go into even further. There are definitely healthier foods you could cook than others. So for example, purple potatoes could positively impact your blood sugar, whereas russet potatoes will negatively impact your blood sugar, giving you more of a sugar hit. And in my opinion, meaning that, russet potatoes that are cooked, are going to be a little more addictive, if you want to say that, although this article would not say addictive on russet potatoes. All right, so now we're going to jump down to the conclusion and my final thoughts. It says, in conclusion, ultra-processed foods now dominate our food environment and are strongly implicated in the rising rates of obesity and diet-related issues. Ultra-processed foods are created in ways that parallel development of addictive drugs, including the inclusion of unnaturally high dose of rewarding ingredients that are rapidly absorbed into the system and enhanced through additives. As with addictive drugs, some but not all individuals exhibit an addictive pattern of consumption marked by diminished control over intake, intense cravings, and an inability to cut down despite negative consequences. So yeah, so that's saying that ultra-processed foods are everywhere. I mean, fast food chains, all the lines, supermarkets. I mean, most of the supermarkets, ultra-processed foods. And this is what most Americans eat, and this is why most Americans are overweight. And also, it's hard to get off the processed foods. So that's why, going raw, for example, will totally get you off the ultra-processed foods. That being said, you can't just lump anything that's cooked is ultra-processed and vice versa. Once again, I try to help you guys realize that certain methods of processing foods can be better or worse than others, because the methods I attempt to process my foods, I'm trying to retain the most beneficial compounds in the foods, right? So that my body and also my microbiome can benefit. So, I mean, in summary, I will say, once you start processing food too much, then you could potentially make it more ultra-processed. So, even in a raw foods context, right, I discourage highly dehydration, where you remove water content out of the fruits. I got into that sticky trap myself, literally, and that did not serve my health. I also, when I was younger, got into juicing too many fruits, where I'm removing the fiber component of the fruit. And yes, orange juice and other fruit juices taste great, but in the long run, I believe they will not serve your health as much as vacuum blending them or eating them whole, for example. And, you guys are all on your own path, your own journey. You guys are, welcome to have your own ideas about these things. On my YouTube channel, I share my personal opinions, based on my experiences, also based on the science. And I'm going to tell you guys this, like, for me, when I heat process foods, they're like the least heat process you could do. I mean, yes, they are not raw. And if you still want to not say that John's a raw vegan because I eat a small percentage of heat processed foods, that's your right. Once again, I want to be inclusive with my viewers and everybody out there. And, hey, if you're eating 75% raw, because I still believe in the raw foods and why they are so beneficial, but also these days I see some benefit that the heat processed foods, not only benefiting me, but more importantly, my microbiome, which I'm in partnership with for my entire life. And, if you do not make friends of your microbiome in the long run, that's, in my opinion, will be cutting your life short, because you're not paying attention to them. They're responsible for so many things that we both have now discovered and even not discovered at this time. So after watching this episode, I really want to encourage you guys to process your foods in the minimal ways as possible, and as much as my raw food cohorts and friends and even people that are on, keto and carnivore diets, I mean, we all talk against the processed foods. So if you are still eating processed foods, hey, going from processed foods, putting something in the Instant Pot and eating it plain with minimal additions to it, you're making steps in the right direction. And that's the message of my channel, is to make a step in the right direction. I mean, everybody, I believe, needs to get the ultra processed foods out of their diets, whether they are pre-bought at a fast food place, at a restaurant, or even if you're making them at home. We want to get back to eating more natural foods that are minimally processed as possible, and that's simply what I share on this channel. I really hope you guys enjoyed this episode today, and if you guys did, hey, please give this video a big thumbs up. More importantly, share this with other people that want to learn if actually all cooked foods are addictive, so that they could learn the science about it, and actually more importantly, what makes a food addictive. And if you do eat heat processed foods or cooked foods on your raw diet, I still don't advocate you guys eat anything ultra processed or things high in fat, sugar, and salt and oil. You know, these things can be problematic and cause issues in the long run, because also if you're eating too many of those foods, which have also been shown to have less nutrition, you're also just basically bulking up on calories and not getting enough of the valuable plant micronutrients. Also, be sure to click that subscribe button right down below so you don't miss my new and upcoming episodes. I'll come out every 5 to 7 days. You never know where sharp or what you'll be learning on my YouTube channel. Make sure you click the little bell so you get notified as my videos come out. And also make sure you watch the last video I posted down below if you haven't already, where I basically compare steaming versus dehydration, and so why I choose to eat steamed foods instead of dehydrated foods. You know, I believe them to be of major benefit when eaten in small quantities. They don't make up any large portion of my diet. And actually today I just had 2 quarts of juice so far, and my next meal is gonna be a nice, amazing fruit meal. So with that, my name is John Cola with OKRaw.com. I'll see you next time, and until then, remember, keep eating your fresh fruits and vegetables. They're always the best.